All right. Hey, third graders. It is Thursday, May 7th. So we are back going to read chapters 15 and 16 today, and then we will read our very last chapter 17 tomorrow on Friday, May the 8th. Let's recap really quick what we read last week. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see. So last week we left off at the end of chapter 14. And we were shocked to see something really sad that Aslan had done. Remember, last week we learned that with a betrayal or a traitor, the White Witch had a chance to take a life. And so that life would have been Edmund's. But Aslan talked to her and they worked out a deal where Aslan would give up his life in place of Edmund. And so Edmund would be able to keep his life. So at the very end, we read that Lucy and Susan had snuck out to find him, and they did. And they went and they saw what was happening, and he had walked to the stone table, and there the White Witch, and all of her evil followers were standing around, and then she took a knife and killed Aslan. And so at the end here it says the children did not see the actual moment of the killing. They couldn't bear to look and had covered their eyes. So that was really sad that we learned about what Aslan had done. So we are going to go ahead and start with chapter 15, and that is Deeper Magic Before the Dawn of Time. So we'll read this and kind of recap and then start on 16 today. All right, let's get started. So while the two girls still crouched in the bushes with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now follow me all, and we will set about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and the traitors now that the great fool, the great cat, lies dead." Okay, so remember, as right before she was going to kill Aslan, remember she had basically told him, that whispered in his ear that, after you're gone, what's going to stop me from killing Edmund and the humans, and you won't be able to do anything about it. So you can kind of see here that that's her plan. All right, at this moment, the children were for a few seconds in very great danger. For with wild cries and the noise of skirling pipes and shrill horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping off the hilltop and down the slope right past their hiding place. They felt the specters go by them like a cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs. And overhead there went a flurry of foul wings and blackness of vultures and giant bats. At any other time they would have trembled with fear, but now the sadness and shame and horror of Aslan's death so filled their minds that they hardly thought of it. As soon as the wood was silent again, Susan and Lucy crept out onto the open hilltop. The moon was getting low and thin. Clouds were passing across her, but they could see the shape of the lion lying dead in his bonds. And down they both knelt in the wet grass and kissed his cold face and stroked his beautiful fur, what was left of it, and cried till they could cry no more. And then they looked at each other and held each other's hands for mere loneliness and cried, and then again were silent. At last Lucy said, "I can't bear to look at that horrible muzzle. I wonder, could we take it off?" So they tried, and after a lot of working at it, for their fingers were cold, and it was now the darkest part of the night, they succeeded. And when they saw his face without it, they burst out crying again and kissed it and fondled it and wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could. And it was all more lonely and hopeless and horrid than I know how to describe. "I wonder could we untie him as well," said Susan presently. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had drawn the cord so tight that the girls could make nothing of the knots. I hope no one who reads this book has been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you have been, If you've been up all night and cried till you have no more tears left in you, you will know that there comes in the end of a sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing were ever going to happen again. At any rate, that was how it felt to these two. Hours and hours seemed to go by in this dead calm, and they hardly noticed that they were getting colder and colder. But at last Lucy noticed two other things. One was that the sky was on the east side of the hill, was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago. The other was some tiny movement going on in the grass at her feet. At last, she took no interest in this. What did it matter? Nothing mattered now. But at last, she saw that whatever it was had begun to move up the upright stones of the stone table, and now, whatever they were moving about on Aslan's body. She peered closer. They were little tiny gray things. Ugh, said Susan from the other side of the table. How beastly! There are horrid little mice crawling all over him. Go away, you little beasts! And she raised her hand to frighten them away. Wait, said Lucy, who had been looking at them more closely now. Can you see what they're doing? Both the girls bent down and stared. I do believe, said Susan, but how queer. They're nibbling away at the cords. That's what I thought, said Lucy. I think they're friendly mice. Poor little things. They don't realize he's dead. They think it'll do some good untying him. It was quite definitely lighter by now. Each of the girls noticed for the first time the white face of the other. They could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of little field mice, and at last, one by one, the ropes were all gnawed through. And the sky in the east was whitish now, and the stars were getting fainter, all except one very big one low down on the eastern horizon. They felt colder than they had been all night. The mice crept away again. The girls cleared away the remains of the gnawed ropes. Aslan looked more like himself without them. Every moment his dead face looked nobler as the light grew and they could see it better. In the wood behind them, a bird gave a chuckling sound. It had been so still for hours and hours that it startled them. Then another bird answered it. Soon there were birds singing all over the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, not late night. I'm so cold, said Lucy. So am I, said Susan. Let's walk about a bit. They walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country all looked dark, gray, but beyond, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale. The sky began to turn red, and they walked to and fro more times than they could count between the dead Aslan and the eastern ridge, trying to keep warm. And oh, how tired their legs felt. Then at last, as they stood for a moment, looking out toward the sea and Cair Paravel, which they could now just make out, the red turned to gold along the line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. At that moment they heard from behind them a great noise, a great cracking, deafening noise, as if a giant had broken a giant's plate. What's that? Said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. I feel afraid to turn around, said Susan. Something awful is happening. They're doing something worse to him, said Lucy. Come on. And she turned, pulling Susan round with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All colors and shadows were changed, that for a moment they didn't see the important thing. Then they did. The stone table was broken into pieces with a great crack, and ran down it from the end to end, and there was no Aslan. Oh, 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 cried the two girls, rushing back to the table. Oh, it's too bad, sobbed Lucy. They might have left the body alone. Who's done it? Cried Susan. What does it mean? Is it more magic? Yes, said a great voice behind their backs. It is more magic. They looked around, and there, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. Oh, Aslan! Cried both the girls, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. Aren't you dead then? Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan? Said Lucy. Not now, said Aslan. You're not a asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. "Do I look it?" he asked. "Oh, you're real! You're real! Oh, Aslan!" cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. "But what does it all mean?" asked Susan, when they were somewhat calmer. "It means," said Aslan, "that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still, which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backward. And now? Oh, yes, now?" said Lucy, jumping up and clapping her hands. "Oh, children," said the lion, "I feel my strength coming back to me. Oh, children, catch me if you can." And he stood up for a second, his eyes very bright, his limbs quivering, lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a leap high over their heads and landed on the other side of the table. Laughing, though she didn't know why, Lucy scrambled over it to reach him. Aslan leaped again. A mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, hopelessly out of their reach, now letting them almost catch his tail, now diving between them, now tossing them in the air with his huge and beautifully velveted paws and catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly so that all three of them rolled over together in a happy, laughing heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp as no one has ever had except in Narnia, and whether it was more like playing than a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three finally lay together, panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least tired or hungry or thirsty. "And now," said Aslan presently, "to business. I feel I am going to roar. You had better put your fingers in your ears." And they did. And Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face became so terrible that they did not dare look at it. And they saw all the trees in front of him bend before the blast of his roaring, as grass bends in a meadow before the wind. Then he said, "We have a long journey to go. You must ride on me." And he crouched down, and the children climbed onto his warm golden back. Susan sat first, holding on tightly to his mane, and Lucy sat behind, holding on tightly to Susan. And with a great heave, he rose underneath them and then shot off faster than any horse could go, downhill and into the thick of the forest. That ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever had a gallop on a horse? Think of that, and then take away the heavy noise of the hoofs and the jingle of the bits, and imagine instead the almost noiseless padding of the great paws. Then imagine instead of the black or gray chestnut back of the horse, the soft roughness of a golden fur and the mane flying back in the wind. And then imagine you are going about twice as fast as the fastest racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushes on and on, never missing his footling, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between the tree trunks, jumping over bush and briar and the smallest streams, wading the larger, swimming the largest of all. And you are riding not on a road, nor in a park, nor even on the downs, but right across Narnia in spring, down solemn avenues of beech and across sunny glades of oak, through wild orchards and snow-white cherry trees, past up roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks and echoing caverns, up windy slopes alight with gorse bushes, and across the shoulders of heathery mountains and along giddy ridges, and down, down, down again into wild valleys and out into acres of blue flowers. It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down at a steep hillside at a castle, a little toy castle, it looked from where they stood, which seemed to be all pointed towers. But the lion was rushing down at a speed that it grew large every moment, and before they had time to ask themselves what it was, they were already on level with it, And now it no longer looked like a toy castle, but rose frowning in front of them. No face looked over the battlements, and the gates were fast shut. And Aslan, not at all slacking his pace, rushed straight as a bullet toward it. "The witch is home," he cried. "Now, children, hold tight." Next moment, the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them, for the lion had gathered himself together, and for a greater leap than any had yet made and jumped, or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back in the middle of a wide stone courtyard full of statues. All right, so that ends chapter 15. So great news. We learn that Aslan raises up from his death and he is alive. Um, do you remember what it said, how he was able to come to life? It said that when somebody gives up a life who was not a traitor and who was innocent and not really guilty, then the stone table will break and they will come back to life. So Aslan came back to life. So Susan and Lucy, of course, are overjoyed, and all of his fur grew back and he was normal again, and they had an amazing time because, I mean, imagine coming back to life. He was super happy and he felt like roaring and running around and playing, and that's exactly what they did. All right, and then as we leave off in chapter 15, we learn that for some reason they're going to go see the White Witch. So we can't imagine how she's going to feel when she sees Aslan. So let's read chapter 16 and then we will stop there. So what happened about the statues? So remember, they have Aslan with Lucy and Susan on his back have jumped the castle wall to where the White Witch's home is, and then they land into the middle of this courtyard that's full of statues. So remember what the statues are, and they are people that lived in Narnia at one time that have been turned into these statues. So maybe that gives you a little bit of idea of what might happen now that Aslan's been made alive again. So what happened about the statues? Chapter 16. "What an extraordinary place," cried Lucy. "All those stone animals, and people too. It's like a museum." "Hush," said Susan. "Aslan's doing something." He was indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion and breathed on him. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked around, almost as if he had been a cat chasing its tail, and breathed also on the stone dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on a tall stone dryad, which stood beyond the dwarf, turned rapidly aside to deal with a stone rabbit on his right, and rushed on to two centaurs. But at last, at that moment, Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at the lion. I expected you've seen someone put a lighted match to a bit of newspaper, which is propped up in a grate against an unlit fire, and for a second nothing seems to have happened. And then you noticed a tiny streak of flame creeping along the edge of the newspaper. It was like that now. For a second, Aslan had breathed on him, the stone lion looked just the same, and then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back. Then it spread. Then the color seemed to lick all over him, as the flame licks all over a bit of paper. Then, while his hindquarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane, and all the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. Then he opened a great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a prodigious yawn. And now his hind legs had come to life. He lifted one of them and scratched himself. Then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him, frisking around him, whimpering with delight, and jumping up to lick his face. Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful that they soon forgot about him. Everywhere the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum, it looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing round till he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white, the courtyard was now a blaze of colors: glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, ruddy brown of foxes, dogs and satyrs, and yellow stockings, crimson hoods of dwarfs, and the birch girls in silver, and the beech girls in fresh transparent green, and the larch girls in green so bright that it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with the sound of happy roarings, brayings, yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts, hurrahs, songs, and laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone, "look, I mean, is it safe?" And Lucy looked and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the feet of the stone giant. "It's all right," shouted Aslan joyously. "Once the feet are put right, all the rest of him will follow." "That wasn't exactly what I meant," whispered Susan to Lucy, but it was too late to do anything about it now. Even if Aslan would have listened to her, the charge was already creeping up the giant's legs. Now he was moving his feet. A moment later he lifted the club off his shoulder, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Bless me, I must have been asleep. Now, what's that dratted little witch that was running about on the ground?" "Somewhere just by my feet it was." But when everyone had shouted up to him to explain what had really happened, and when the giant had put his hand to his ear and got them to repeat it all again, so that at last he understood, then he bowed down till his head was no further off the top of a haystack, and touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan, beaming all over his honest, ugly face. Giants of any sort are now so rare in England, and so few giants are good-tempered, that 10 to 1 you have never seen a giant when his face is beaming. It's a sight well worth looking at. "Now for the inside of the house," said Aslan. "Look alive, everyone. Upstairs and downstairs and in my lady's chamber. Leave no corner unsearched. You never know where some poor prisoner may be concealed." And into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible, fusty old castle echoed with the opening of windows and with everyone's voices crying out at once, "Don't forget the dungeons! Give us a hand with this door! Here's another little winding stair! Oh, I say, here's a poor kangaroo! Call Aslan! Phew! How it smells in here! Look out for the trapdoors! Up here! There are a whole lot more on the landing." But the best of all was when Lucy came rushing upstairs, shouting out, "Aslan, Aslan, I found Mr. Tumnus. Oh, do come quick." Okay, so remember Mr. Tumnus, who Lucy met at the very beginning. A moment later, Lucy and the little fawn were holding each other by both hands and dancing round and round for joy. The little chap was none the worse for having been a statue, and was, of course, very interested in all she had to tell him. But at last, the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended. The whole castle stood empty, of every door and window open, and the light and the sweet spring of air flooding into all the dark and evil places which needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard. And it was then that someone, Tumnus, I think, first said, "But how are we going to get out?" For Aslan had got in a jump, and the gates were still locked. "That'll be all right," said Aslan, and then, rising on his hind legs, he bawled up at the giant. "Hi, you up there," he roared. "What's your name?" "Giant Rumblebuffin." "It is, please, your honor," said the giant, once more touching his cap. "Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin," said Aslan, "just let us out of this, will you?" "Certainly, your honor, it will be a pleasure," said Giant Rumblebuffin. "Stand well away from the gates, all you little uns." Then he strode to the gate himself, and bang, bang, bang went his huge club. The gates creaked at the first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. And then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, Both the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust cleared, it was odd, standing in that dry, grim, stony yard, to see through the gap all the grass and waving trees and sparkling streams of the forest, and the blue hills beyond that, and beyond them, the sky. Blowed if I ain't blowed if I ain't all in a muck sweat, said the giant, puffing like the largest railway engine. Comes of being out of condition. I suppose neither of you young ladies has such a thing as a pocket handkerchief about you. Yes, I have, said Lucy, standing on tiptoes and holding her handkerchief up as far as she could reach. Thank you, Missy, said Giant Rumblebuffin, stooping down. Next moment, Lucy got rather a fright, for she found herself caught up in a midair between the giant's finger and thumb. But just as she was getting near his face, he suddenly started and then put her gently back on the ground, muttering, Bless me, I've picked up the little girl instead. I beg your pardon, Missy. I thought you was the handkerchief. No, no, said Lucy, laughing. Here it is. This time he managed to get it, but it was only about the same size to him as a century tablet would be to you. So that when she saw him solemnly rubbing it to and fro across his giant red face, she said, I'm afraid it's not much use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin. Not at all, not at all, said the giant politely. Never met a nicer handkerchief. So fine, so handy, so I don't know how to describe it. What a nice giant he is, said Lucy to Mr. Tumnus. Oh, yes, replied the fawn. All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. I never knew a giant that was, but an old family with traditions, you know. He'd been the other sort. She'd never have turned into stone. Okay, I want to go back just for a second, because I meant to say right here that it was a saccharin tablet. So it was, anyway, the point is that the handkerchief was so tiny that it was like a little tablet or like a little pill, like it would look to us, is what they were trying to say. All right, moving on. At this point, Aslan clapped his paws together and called for silence. Our day's work is not yet over, he said, and if the witch is to be finally defeated before bedtime, we must find the battle at once, and join in. I hope, sir, added the largest of the centaurs. Of course, said Aslan, and now those who can't keep up, that is, children, dwarfs, and small animals, must ride on the backs of those who can. That is, lions, centaurs, unicorns, horses, giants, and eagles. Those who are good with their noses must come in the front with us lions to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves. And with a great deal of bustle and cheering they did. The most pleased of the lot was the other lion, who kept running about everywhere, pretending to be very busy, but really in order to say to everyone he met. Did you hear what he said? Us lions? That means him and me. Us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No side, no standoffishness. Us lions. That meant him and me. At least he went on saying this till Aslan had loaded him up with 3 dwarfs, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits, and a hedgehog. That steadied him a bit. When all were ready, it was a big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan most in getting them sorted into their proper order. They set out through the gap in the castle wall. At first, the lions and the dogs went nosing about in all directions, but then suddenly one great hound picked up the scent and gave a bay. There was no time lost after that. Soon all the dogs and lions and wolves and other hunting animals were going at full speed with their noses to the ground, and all the others, streaked out for about half a mile behind them, were following as fast as they could. The noise was like an English fox hunt, only better, because every now and then with the music of the hounds was mixed the roar of the other lion, and sometimes the far deeper and more awful roar of Aslan himself. Faster and faster they went, as the scent became easier and easier to follow. And then, just as they came to the last curve in a narrow, winding valley, Lucy heard above all these noises another noise, a different one, which gave her a very gave her a queer feeling inside. It was a noise of shouts and shrieks and of the clashing of metal against metal. Then they came out of the narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There stood Peter and Edmund and all the rest of Aslan's army, fighting desperately against the crowd of horrible creatures whom she had seen last night. Only now, in the daylight, they looked even stranger and more evil and more deformed. There also seemed to be far more of them. Peter's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few, and there were statues dotted all over the battlefield, so apparently the witch had been using her wand. But she did not seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her stone knife. It was Peter she was fighting, both of them going at it so hard that Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. She only saw the stone knife and Peter's sword flashing so quickly that they looked like 3 knives and 3 swords. That pair were in the center. On each side, the line stretched out. Horrible things were happening wherever she looked. "Off my back, children!" shouted Aslan, and they both tumbled off. Then with a roar they shook all Narnia, from the western lamppost to the shores of the eastern sea. The great beast flung himself upon the White Witch. Lucy saw her face lifted toward him for 1 second with an expression of terror and amazement. Then lion and witch had rolled over together, but with the witch underneath, and at the same moment all warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed madly on the enemy lines. Dwarves with their battle axes, dogs with their teeth, the giant with his club and his feet also crushed dozens of the foe. Unicorns with their horns, centaurs with swords and hooves, and Peter's tired army cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemies squealed and gibbered till the wood re-echoed with the din of that onset. All right, so that's kind of a good cliffhanger for tomorrow's last chapter 17. All right, so they go, Aslan and Lucy and Susan go to the White Witch's castle, and Aslan turns all of the statues back to living creatures, not statues anymore, and they were all people and creatures that were good and that were on Aslan's side and that were part of, some of them are part of his army. So, and then we meet that really awesome giant. So, I mean, I guess if you were a kid like Lucy and Susan, you might think that because a giant is a giant that he would be a bad guy. So that's why Lucy was concerned, but he ended up being a good giant. So, all right. So then they go and travel and sniff out the scent of where the White Witch is, and they find her, and they come across seeing her battling with Peter. So they all chime in to help. Of course, Aslan jumps on her, and then it's the White Witch and Aslan rumbling and tumbling and fighting in this big battle. You can kind of just imagine it in your head. And then all of these good unicorns and centaurs and other creatures that are on Aslan's side helping. So that's where we're leaving off today. And then we will end with chapter 17 tomorrow and find out what happens and how this ends, because I have a lot of questions. So if you haven't finished the book yet, you probably have the same questions I do. So I'm wondering, who's going to win? If the children and Aslan win, then are they going to go sit on the 4 thrones at the castle? And if they do that, how are they going to leave Narnia? Is it the people where they're from going to wonder where they are? And so there's lots of questions. So hopefully chapter 17 will wrap all of that up. So also this week, I don't want you to worry about an assignment. The last and final assignment for this novel study book will be just you taking the AR test. That will be your final grade on this novel study. So as soon as we finish this book, you can take the AR test, and that will be your final score. So we will finish it tomorrow. unless you have already finished it, and then you can take the AR test. So if you can take the AR test by tomorrow, which will be Friday, that would be great. And your teachers will get all your grades wrapped up next week, and that will be the end, because remember, next week, next Friday, May the 15th, is our last day of school. All right, so I will see you again tomorrow, and we will read chapter 17, The Hunting of the White Stag. So, all right, so that concludes that today. So I will see you tomorrow. Bye.